Hello, good morning. Welcome to our Vuelio webinar, Future Planning for the Built Environment, tackling the challenges facing the housing and planning sectors. Before I introduce our panel, I want to invite my colleague from Vuelio's monitoring team, our policy researcher, Jennifer Prescott, and Jennifer specialising in the built environment and communities. So Jen, I know you have a few comments to make at the beginning before we kick off the discussion.
Yeah, great. So hi everyone. So to begin, we thought it would be a good idea to give some background and some context to the discussion. So recently there have been a lot of policy developments which are wide-ranging and impact all different areas of the housing sector. So from planning reforms to house building targets to home ownership. And these come at a time of great uncertainty, a time when housing associations are worried about their tenants' income because of the pandemic, and concerns that the homelessness crisis will worsen in the upcoming months. In addition to this, there's the social housing paper, which is continuously delayed and eagerly anticipated by the sector, and this could also change the direction of the discussion when it's published. So in order to address some of these issues, the government has recently proposed some big reforms, such as the Planning White Paper, which was published in August. So the White Paper sets out reforms to streamline and modernise the planning process, bring a new focus to design and sustainability, improve the system of developer contributions to infrastructure, and ensure more land is available for development where it's needed. The White Paper contains proposals to give greater freedom for buildings and land in town centres to change use without planning permission and create new homes from the regeneration of vacant and redundant buildings. So one really significant departure from the existing system is that under the new planning regime, the government will have the power to dictate how many homes are built in each area. So for decades, local authorities have calculated the number of homes they need as part of their local plans, and then they've been able to decide the number they feel they can actually deliver based on land constraints in the area. But the recent white paper proposes that Whitehall dictates to each local authority how much housing it must deliver over the next decade. Now this has caused a backlash from other parties, with opposition figures calling the proposals a power grab. There are also concerns around the proposals of scrapping Section 106 and the Community Infrastructure Levy in favour of a nationally set charge for developers. We've heard from the National Housing Federation warnings that this has serious implications for the amount of affordable homes housing associations can build, and smaller and rural housing associations are particularly reliant on Section 106 to deliver new affordable homes and would therefore be disproportionately affected. Another big change to the housing sector is the government's pledge on home ownership. So at the recent Conservative Party conference, Boris Johnson pledged to fix the broken housing market and promised to turn generation rent into generation buy. He announced that to achieve this, the government will take forward this manifesto pledge to set up a market for long-term fixed-rate loans for first-time buyers, which will require deposits of just 5%. But there have been reports that the lack of detail has left lenders confused as to how this can be achieved, especially in the current climate, as lenders are worried that falls in house prices could leave them exposed to big losses. Many have said that the scheme ignores one big problem, a serious lack of housing. There just aren't enough housing for these people to buy. So there's a lot of conversations happening at the moment in the sector, which are wide and varied, with some contentious proposals being put forward. But yeah, I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thanks very much. So I should have said I'm Sam Webber. I'm the External Relations Manager at Vuelio, and I want to thank all of our panel that I'm about to introduce for joining us today, and to encourage any listeners who are following that want to contribute to the online conversation, especially on Twitter, to use the hashtag either Vuelio or Vuelio Politics, VUELIO. And so thanks again to our panel. So let me introduce Dr. Jonathan Carr-West, the Chief Exec of the LGIU, Baroness Kath Pinnock, the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for communities and local government in the House of Lords, who is also a councillor in Kirklees in West Yorkshire. Councillor Alex Hollingsworth, Cabinet Member for Planning and Housing Delivery on Oxford City Council, who's also an LGIU trustee. And also Councillor Bridget Smith, the leader of South Cambridgeshire District Council. And to talk about the technology side of things in this debate, Phil Hutton, who's the head of product and strategy at Idox. So thank you very much, panel. I'm going to kick off, I think, Jonathan, because I know you've partnered with us pulling this together in terms of Jen's introduction and sort of how that sets into context the debate around the white paper, the Planning for the Future white paper. And obviously, incidentally, to remind everybody, the consultation on that document closes in 2 days' time, on the 29th of October. So, Jonathan, over to you initially.
Thanks, Sam. Well, look, we know that we have a housing crisis. There's nothing new about that. But this is a crisis with multiple dysfunctional aspects. You could name a few of those. We're 200,000 houses a year short of what we need. The relationship of house price to income is wildly out of kilter. There's 1 million homes unbuilt that have planning permission around the country. We know from our research at LGIU that the process of agreeing local plans has been patchy, to put it diplomatically. We know that there are huge issues, particularly with bringing small sites into land supplies. And we know that actually the majority of councillors around the country don't feel that they particularly have a grip on this anyway. They think that developers are in the driving seat and central government. We know that the private rental sector needs reform. We know that the local housing allowance is a really blunt tool, too low in much of the country, too high in other places. And that contributes to the most dysfunctional element of all, which is a sharp rise in the number of people who don't have homes at all. So faced with all this, we can see the temptation, I think, to centralise and manage, to say, right, we'll set targets, we'll make councils do it, we'll override this NIMBYism, and various governments have flirted with this. And the current white paper, as Jen was pointing out, seems to be a further step in that direction. Why is that a mistake? Well, let's note in passing that unlike sometimes central government, councils can get stuff done. So, for example, we've seen 14,000 people moved into emergency accommodation through the COVID pandemic. But most importantly, this centralising approach doesn't address the market issues. If developers are not building, it's because of financing and profitability, not because of planning. It doesn't address issues in the private rental sector. If families are insecure in rented homes, that's because of the types of tenancies they have, not because of planning. And of course, it takes a really one-dimensional bricks and mortar view of housing. We'll just build stuff and people will live in it. But we're not really, we shouldn't really be talking about houses. We're talking about homes. Homes that people want to live in and that other people want near them. Homes that are connected to places which enhance the places they're in. Homes which people are happy in which they flourish, in which they contribute to their communities. And, of course, shelter is a basic human need. But homes provide so much more than that. I don't want to get all sort of Maslow about it, but shelter is the sort of the basic building block of happiness. But actually, homes provide all the other things, an opportunity to flourish, a safe space, a place to be creative. Now, that means you need a different type of conversation, one that's not just about how many houses you build, but about the quality of those houses, about connectivity, about community, about place, the character of place. And that's a conversation that's not just about planning, but about local economic development, about the public service ecosystem, about the public realm more broadly. And that, I would argue, is a conversation that needs to happen locally, that can only happen locally, that needs to have a democratic mandate, that needs to join up multiple policy areas from housing, public health, education, roads, green space, local economic development, all sorts of things. And frankly, you just can't do that from a bunch of buildings by the Thames.
Can I bring on that point, on that local point, Jonathan, if I may bring in Baroness Pinnock, one of our local councillors and obviously a member of the House of Lords as well. Baroness Pinnock, what do you think about that lack of democratic accountability potentially being lost from local authorities and being decided centrally? Is that a concern that you've heard in the Lords or indeed on Kirklees Council?
Oh, absolutely. The two issues, picking up from what Jonathan has just said, that are of prime importance, I think, both to myself and colleagues as Liberal Democrats, but also to local residents. The two things that are of prime importance are place shaping, that they have a say in what their town or their village or their urban area looks like and becomes. And the second thing that's really important is that they have a say. And the biggest, I think, criticism that we have, perhaps not the biggest because there's several big ones, of the planning white paper, is that they are going to cut out local people from their right to have a say in their place, what their place is going to be like. And in my experience, having because I've been a councillor for a while, having done sort of 2, possibly 3 local plans, what I do know is that engaging local people, local folk in the strategic allocation of land for housing and business and so on, is not where they get interested, because that's quite a difficult concept to think about what land allocation will result in when it's developed. And this is what the planning white paper is proposing. Just do the land allocation and the developers will sort the rest. Well, no, actually where people really get involved is, are you really going to put 50, 100 houses in this small place? What's going to happen to our local schools? What will the traffic congestion be like? What about air quality? Those are the sort of issues that then come to the fore. And to suggest, as the planning white paper is doing, that those voices will not be heard either by local people or indeed by their local representatives is just a recipe for a big a fallout between local residents and the government that proposes this. So what we need to do is, it's not this, I mean, I'd have to say, I think the planning white paper feels to me like a developer's charter rather than a homes for people charter, which is what I hope it would be, because it doesn't address, from anything that I've seen, the issue of the absolute need for more houses for social rent. That's the big area that is missing totally. And I know from my own council in Kirklees, but also across the country, there's a growing need for housing for social rent, to improve the quality of housing that people are living in, and to do all the things that Jonathan has said about connectivity and having a voice heard through their landlords, which you can't get through private rents. So there's big issues here, but at the heart it's place shaping, democratic voice that is missing from this planning white paper.
Let me bring in Alex Hollingsworth, if I may, on that point from Oxford City Council. Alex, I know you've talked a lot about local plans and the variation in places. Clearly, Oxford being a very specific city, and every single local authority having their own concerns. And I don't know whether you'd like to speak about about your concerns here about the white paper, whether they're reflecting diversity in community.
Well, I think inevitably it doesn't. It's very difficult to know where to start, because I think more or less every single premise in the plan is wrong, in the white paper is wrong. Mm. But I think one of the major flaws is that in the pursuit for a fictional simplicity, essentially it's got a far too broad a brush approach. So there's the 3 different sorts of zone, and each one will be approached slightly differently. But in any place, whether it's a city like Oxford, which obviously got a very internationally famous and complex historic built environment with many listed buildings and conservation areas, but the same is true of any town, any city, any village, any rural area across the country. There are character areas, to use a planning term, which are half a dozen houses, a street. You know, you can't apply this kind of broad brush approach without going down to a level of granularity that's simply impossible with the tools that are proposed, and in particular the timescale. So an example I would use, there's a neighbourhood plan in Oxford, covers roughly a parish area equivalent, has a dozen, 15 different character areas in it. Each has their own essentially design premise. So in the white paper's world, each would require its own separate design code. That's an enormously complex piece of work to be pulled together. Yet each local authority is supposed to produce a local plan for their whole area in 30 months. I've just completed ours in Oxford. It took 48 months, 4 extensive rounds of qualitative consultation, because consultation is done best when you have conversations with people and you have a dialogue with them, and that's an intensive and extensive piece of work. There is no way on earth that any local authority, no matter how well resourced, could possibly produce a plan of sufficient quality in 30 months without either taking twice as long or 3 times as long, or producing something which loses all that granularity that people recognise in their communities. It's literally impossible.
Okay, right. That's useful. I mean, on that one particular point, to come back on the engagement under the current system. I mean, one thing the white paper spells out is that engagement with residents is very, very low. I think it mentions between 1% and 3% in some cases. So perhaps there is an argument that says that the current system isn't necessarily working either in terms of the high number of appeals, you know, properties that are declined but overturned on appeal, or indeed a low level of engagement currently. So perhaps something does have to change under the current system there in terms of engagement, or a third of.
Well, I think that
appeals.
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 different elements there. I think I'm not convinced that there's a high number of appeals. The vast majority of planning applications are approved first time round, so the number of appeals is fairly limited, and where there are individual authorities that are perhaps too ready to refuse, that's highlighted, but the evidence would suggest that there isn't such a problem. The level of engagement, yes, it can vary, but as Baroness Pinnock said, you know, the degree to which people get engaged with a contentious planning application in their area can be huge. I have one which is a single house, and because it's in a very sensitive site, I was looking at the 150 different objections this morning. So there's heavy engagement there, and it is certainly true that you can get very extensive engagement with the local plan making process. Charwell Council in Oxfordshire, just to the north of here, had 30,000 contributions to its local plan a few years ago because it was highly contentious. And I think the issue is where either a local plan is contentious or important, or where the council, as has happened in Oxford, as many other councils, have gone out and sought to make sure that consultation happens with communities who don't normally engage. And I think that's the one probably fair critique there, that there are harder to engage with communities when it comes to planning. Then you can do it, but it's all about doing qualitative consultation. You don't need to rip up the entire 1947 Town and Country Planning Act and every premise behind it in order to enhance consultation. You need to use tools, technology, but also basic common sense. Max Locke in 1947, when he was doing the local plans in Middlesbrough, sat down and engaged with local people over a prolonged period and asked them what they wanted and listened to what they said. It's not rocket science. That's what you need to do.
Okay. Can I bring in Councillor Bridget Smith from South Cambridgeshire? Because there's obviously, having read up on this, there are concerns about rural districts, rural areas bearing the brunt of these new developments, and obviously having to build, you know, new towns and new communities. So I don't know, Bridget, whether you'd like to speak about your perspective from South Cambridgeshire and your concerns.
So South Cambridgeshire is quite unusual because we are a growth area, and we absolutely accept we're a growth area, and our position on the Oxcam arc means that we're very much the focus of government's attention at the moment for rollout of considerable development across the whole of the arc. So that's fine, and we see that as an opportunity. So, you know, we're building a major new development. It's the first new town in kind of decades at Northstowe. We have others planned at Waterbeach, and Cambourne, which was built 10 years ago now, is thriving and doing really well, and you're quite hard pressed to find a house for sale there. So, you know, we can do that. As far as the white paper is concerned, I mean, I'm the Lib Dem lead on the District Council network, and I also sit on the Local Government Association board as well. But when I was reading the DCN's response, I had to say to them, could we just find something positive to say here? Because actually it was just page after page of negativity, and that actually just makes people switch off. So it was a real challenge. And, you know, the opposition to this is not from the opposition. This is cross-party. I have yet to hear a council leader have one good word to say, though we all admit that, you know, planning could be better. It's really difficult to understand what problems the white paper are trying to solve, and partly because it just ignores the problems of the government's own planning inspectorate. So when I took control of the council back in 2018, the local plan had not been adopted and had been in inspection for 4.5 years, which is a record, longest in history. And in that time, thanks to no 5-year housing land supply, 4,000 houses had been built outside of a plan in the countryside. And, you know, the message is if you do that, you're going to lose control of a council, actually. So, you know, the government needs to put its own house in order. I mean, I heard the minister speak a week ago now. It was really depressing. You know, the big problem is absorption. You know, this paper does not deal with the issue of absorption of housing into the market. No mention of the Letwin report. You know, to me, that was an inspired piece of work, and quite why it's fallen out of recognition, I don't know. Perhaps, you know, perhaps he did something wrong somewhere along the line. But, you know, we need to be digging that out and really revisiting it. The minister's solution seemed to be that SMEs were going to be the cure-all for everything. Now, you know, the number of SME developers has halved in the last decade. You know, they're just not there. And somewhere like South Cambridgeshire, and I'm sure it's the same for Oxford, land values are so high that SMEs can't buy plots of land to build 10, 20, 30 houses unless there's considerable help. Now, I'd like, as a council leader, to be empowered to be able to purchase large lumps of land and then work with the SMEs, because I do think in many situations SMEs build quicker, build better, and often build faster as well. So I do think there's a place for them, but it's very, very misguided to think that they're going to sort out all the absorption problems.
Okay, but is there a wider concern? I think I know figures have stated that it is focusing extra development on London and the southeast, and that, you know, I think 161% increase on homes in that part of the country, and actually the north, where Baroness Pinnock is sort of speaking from, you know, potentially urban areas in the north seeing a reduction of 28%. So it isn't actually fixing the levelling up problem, perhaps, which it is setting out to do.
Yes, I quite agree, and I'm sure Baroness Pinnock can talk much better than me from the northern viewpoint. But, you know, I already have over 30,000 houses in my current local plan. So, you know, in fact, I think the new algorithm actually reduces my numbers. Now, again, you know, it seems very, very arbitrary, and of course, you know, there's other factors play in. So, you know, we're now consulting on East-West Rail. There will be we'll have to deliver houses to pay for East-West Rail. So that, you know, we have a combined authority with a mayoral obligation for an additional 100,000 houses. It's not just about, you know, the government's figure. There's all sorts of other factors play into it. So it's trying to simplify something that is wildly complex.
Now, speaking of something that's wildly complex, can I bring in Phil Hutton, who, with his sort of tech hat on at Idox, obviously is operating the current system for most local authorities. And obviously, Phil, you've got quite a unique perspective about talking about how the system operates now on the digital side of things, and how look to it operating in the future.
And in this discussion, I'm not sure if this is a blessing or a curse, but if the proposals fall into the political and policy-driven aspects and the technical aspects, I would say the technical aspects are perhaps less controversial. The idea that we can achieve, greater engagement, greater efficiency, and many other benefits besides through the appropriate deployment of technology is perhaps not controversial at all. What I probably ought to say, to get my stall out straight away though, and as Sam has pointed to, is that the particular policy proposals aren't the only way of providing those benefits, and in fact, we work with 250 local government or planning authorities who are already delivering some great engagement, who are already using technology to surface appropriate information to make it easy to understand, or easier to understand the planning process, and to guide applicants and contributors towards the right levels of engagement. Now, I ought to say that actually, to be fair, some of the the greater aspirational aims in the proposal from a technology point of view are quite appealing. The ability to maybe take some of the complexity inherent in the planning system and simplify that for the applicant and for the agent and for dare I say the planners themselves, has some real what's the word I'm looking for, appeal. But again, I think I personally, and perhaps all of us, would like to see those things progress anyway. And as I said, I think local authorities up and down the country are already achieving many of these aims within the existing system.
Okay, so because there are calls to reform perhaps the existing system rather than this root and branch new system coming in relatively quickly, and obviously on a tech level to roll it out across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think to sort of draw that question back again. So many of the aims of speed, simplicity, increased, dare I say, automated decision making. Actually, those don't so much rely on the proposals themselves, but on the availability of high quality, accessible data. And I think we sort of touched on the idea of algorithms. Algorithms can't solve every problem in the world, right? Algorithms are subjective in nature, and they're to support decision making based on weighted views or and appropriately used data. So I think actually again part of the direction of travel there, regardless of some of the wider reforms, is to make data across the sector more available for all to consume and make best use of.
Okay. Is there, just following on from something that Jen mentioned in her introduction, is there a perception that this, because of the long-standing delay to the social housing white paper, is there a sort of concern that this isn't being looked at fully, and that actually the government needs to address social housing and obviously homelessness as part of that, rather than just pushing on with huge planning reforms that we're discussing here? Is that something, I mean, Alex, I don't know whether you wanted to touch on, we've mentioned sort of homelessness and how actually, without looking at social housing across the country, different in every single authority, without addressing social housing, this simply can't sort of come to pass, and we're almost looking at under half of the issue here.
Yeah, absolutely. The failure that the government has identified is we're not providing enough affordable housing for people in the right places. It then sets off to try and solve that using the wrong thing. If you look at data going back to 1919 for house building numbers, it's a very famous graph that many people will be familiar with. The only times this country has ever built enough housing is when the private sector and the public sector work together to deliver it. If you've got just the private or just the public, you don't have enough. It's as simple as that. And for the last 30 odd years, we've just not delivered enough social housing through the state. It's a really basic premise. So that's the problem. It's a market failure problem, and many of the issues that Jonathan raised highlight that. The fact that you've got somebody from Oxford and somebody from Cambridge on this call means we're slightly skewed, but these are the two least affordable cities in the country. When you look at prices for houses to buy and to rent compared to average earnings, even more unaffordable than London. So things like first homes with discounted is just pointless. It doesn't achieve anything for people who are in need in places like Oxford. And the proposals that the government have made alongside the white paper, the increase of the threshold for a small site, in our newly approved local plan, it lops a third of the social housing out, and in rural areas where small sites can be the norm, it'll be an even larger number. So it's a really serious impact. But the fundamental problem is a lack of social housing. Successive governments of all stripes have failed to deliver the numbers that were needed. And that's the solution. So tinkering around with or abolishing the planning system is not going to resolve that. What will resolve it is a massive investment long-term in providing social housing and addressing some of the issues around social housing, the stigmatization of social housing as housing of last resort. That needs to stop. And issues around local housing allowance and so on. I mean, it's a long-standing political aphorism, isn't it, that we stopped building social housing and instead spent it all on housing benefit, and I think we all know that, and that is what needs to change.
And in terms of homelessness, obviously we've touched on it. Those of you on local authorities are at the sort of front line of this during the COVID crisis, and I'm aware, certainly as Jen said, this was touched on at Conservative conference, that government has given an allocation to local authorities to sort out rough sleeping and to deal with some of the critical aspects of homelessness. But obviously that's a very short-term measure related to the pandemic, and I don't know if any of you on councils wanted to sort of discuss how that is working and how you've been able to respond to the pandemic in the short term, but obviously how that just raises further concerns down the line for sort of next year.
So if I could come in, so I think what plays badly in this narrative is that when we talk about homelessness, we're only talking about rough sleepers. So South Cambridgeshire is rural. It's very, very rare in my 101 villages and 3 new towns to have rough sleepers. But what I do have is a huge hidden homelessness problem. And this involves over-occupancy. I have young people sleeping in cars. I picked up a young couple. I was horrified in my own village. They'd been sleeping in a car for 2 years. And it was only when the boy broke his leg and couldn't physically get in and out of the car that they came to me, and I was able to get them housed within a matter of 3 days. So it's the hidden homelessness, and government seems to be blind and deaf to hidden homelessness, and the thousands that even places like mine have on their housing list. Never mind the scandal that is London and their housing lists in the terms of tens of thousands.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, I know in Oxford, obviously homelessness, I think you have a link to a homelessness organisation, but obviously it is such a wide issue, and it isn't just rough sleeping. And I know that, as I said, there's been some short-term funding, but I don't know if you wanted to talk about how local authorities are on the front line here and how you need more support to tackle this problem.
Well, first of all, completely agree with what Bridget said. The rough sleeping crisis is a crisis, but it is a tiny tip of a gigantic iceberg of hidden homelessness. Now, as we see the latest data on COVID suggesting a really strong link between overcrowded housing and COVID susceptibility, it's just one more thing that is a consequence of overcrowded housing. But on rough sleeping, yes, the government provided a one-time fix to remove rough sleepers from the street, and I use that word advisedly, that's what it felt like. We were obviously, like all local authorities, able to do that, but dealing with entrenched rough sleeping where mental illness, multiple addictions and ill health are extremely common, by a substantial majority. At least one of those, and probably all of those, will apply to many people who are rough sleeping. You need ongoing wraparound support, as well as housing. You need housing, but you need mental health support, you need addiction support, you need caseworkers. It's really, really difficult. And one of the staff at the organisation that I sit as an observer on the board of says, you need endless wells of patience, because you could be on your 25th time of trying to get somebody into secure housing, and you have to forget the previous 24 times that it's failed and try and get that 25th time to work. And I don't think the government grasps the difficulty of that problem and the expense and the challenge of solving it. And of course, it's a good investment, because in the end, failure to deal with those problems is going to cause at the beginning, causes far worse problems down the line.
And in terms of engagement, I know Baroness Pinnock, obviously you're in the House of Lords, so you're leading on response to this planning and to the pandemic. What advice would you have for our listeners in terms of engagement, who want to engage with government? Obviously, the consultation on the planning white paper specifically has just a few days to run, but in terms of how social housing associations and other stakeholders want to engage with government and with local authorities, I don't know if you've got any advice about how they should go about doing that.
Well, the obvious advice is, first of all, get your views in, even at the last minute on the 29th of October. That's important. But equally important is to lobby your MP, your local councillors, your local council leader, members of the House of Lords. We get lobbied all the time, which is great, because that helps us engage with the views of organisations and individuals across the country. So don't stop just by putting in your views on the planning white paper for the October the 29th. Keep going, because I think people will be aghast when they see what the proposals in the planning white paper are. Be it you are a resident worried that an allocation of a field for housing, they could just build on it regardless of the views of the people around it. People will be very angry about that. I think it prevents councils from fully thinking through the economic recovery plans from COVID. So that there needs to be engagement there. Where I live, which is includes areas of considerable deprivation and housing overcrowding and substandard housing, none of those issues are going to be resolved by the proposals in the white paper. None of them.
And what would you, if you don't mind me saying, what would you say about because obviously there are criticisms of the Section 106 set up at the moment. What would you say about the proposal for this nationally set infrastructure levy? Do you think that would have any impact, or is that not?
Well, the only impact it's likely to have is to be a negative one, because where I am, developers will argue, as they argue now, about affordable housing allocation, that they are, that the viability issues come into play, and they argue out of providing as much so-called affordable housing. I have to say, I think that is a total misnomer, affordable, and we should all stop using it. Most affordable housing, I'm going off on one now, most affordable housing is not affordable to the average person. And the sooner we stop using that term, the more likely are we to address the issues about affordability. But yeah, so it'll be, obviously, if it's nationally set, who will have the largest voice in lobbying to set what the levels of the infrastructure level should be? And it won't be local people, it won't be local councils. It's more likely to be people with a national voice, the developers, and none of that is right. None of that is right. And that's not to say that SIL and Section 106 work effectively, because I don't think they do. But the solution that is proposed is not the right one.
Okay. Jonathan, I wonder if I could bring you back in on this to summarise any comments perhaps, but also that criticism that obviously the system isn't working at present. The criticism we often hear that perhaps it's about 10 of the largest developers that are in control of the situation and the supply, and that's not working, and how to change that, whether this system will change that or not, whether these proposals.
Well, I think these proposals won't change that. I think, if anything, they'll exacerbate it for exactly the reasons that Baroness Pinnock just outlined. I mean, there's no other country in the world virtually in which we would even ask the question of whether it's better to do these things from central government than from local government. I mean, what is local government for if it is not to make decisions around what you build in local places? And I sometimes think that if the government's view is basically that we don't need and shouldn't have local government at all, then let's just say so and let's have that debate rather than trying to kind of do it by stealth, by just sort of slashing away the things that it does. And I think, on another point, this is also all an illustration of the sort of folly of this way of sort of national policy making through white papers, and you wait for ages and then what's the white paper going to say, and then it comes out and it's rubbish and we all complain about it and there's a consultation and we're still waiting on the devolution white paper and the social care green paper, which is only 3.5 years late now. And it's just such a bad way of doing policy. And it seems to me, and to come back to your question about why it doesn't work, all of this goes back to the fact that not trusting in local government, not trusting in local people. It's this idea that if we actually have this debate and we engage and we open it up, there'll just be this sort of NIMBYistic close down and we won't get any houses built at all. And of course, there are places where that is what's happened. But I think that is, if we have local engagement properly in the way that all of our panelists have talked about, Alex talked about this, and that it's not rocket science, it's about conversations over time, having the time and the space and the power to implement those conversations. Actually, I think all the evidence suggests that when you can have those sorts of conversations that are about what sort of place do you want to live in, what sort of homes do you want to be available for your children and your grandchildren, how do you want this place to work? When we have those conversations, you can overcome that sort of the NIMBY problem. Is when we just say, do you want 100 homes put in the field behind you? No, I don't. It's just not. We just start all of this in the wrong place. Now, is local government universally brilliant at doing that consultation, at having those conversations? No, of course it's not, and it needs to get better, and we need to pay attention to that. But the idea that because local government isn't so good at doing it, you can somehow run the whole system from Whitehall just seems to me completely wrong-headed. It's looking down the wrong end of the telescope. And as I say, it's not quite a uniquely British disease, but very closely. This whole, I'm sorry to say, a lot of this conversation would just seem crazy, absurd, and strange to people in most other countries.
Okay. And in terms, Jonathan, just in terms briefly of your advice to people who want to engage and want to have an input into this system, what would be your advice for those states?
First thing, talk to your councillors. I think the number of sort of quality conversations that people have with their local council, and this is a bigger problem. Most people don't know who their councillors are. Most people, 7 out of 10 of us, didn't go out and vote for them. You've got to start by understanding the local political landscape and by engaging with those councillors. And maybe, it's a radical idea, don't wait until there's a problem you want to be resolved and then complain about it, but get engaged in sort of ongoing conversations with your councillors, which I would argue 90% of ward councillors are willing and want to have, about how you shape the areas you live in, economically, physically and socially.
Okay, I'm aware we're running out of time. I just wanted to come back to Phil on the tech side of things, because Phil, the white paper does talk about how the new system will be more streamlined. It'll use data. It'll be far less bureaucratic and paper heavy. But obviously, on your side of things, working as you do with so many of these councils, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say about your thoughts about how the next few years are going to pan out, whether there'll be a delay to bringing in these changes, for example.
Well, obviously adoption takes time in any event, and while we're busily preparing for whatever might come next, people need to carry on doing what they're doing now. So, I think certainly, the idea of all local authorities perhaps needing to perform a wide-scale local plan consultation using technology and approaches that don't perhaps quite exist in a ubiquitous way in less than a year is quite interesting. But I think, in terms of streamlining and efficiency, and we're sort of getting carried away with these terms a little bit. I mean, really using emerging technology, to put more power in the hands of the experienced and knowledgeable planners who actually need to be involved in this process, I think is what is perhaps going to move us forward here. And that's why, as I said, I think aspirationally the technical, focusing on that narrow slice again, the technical aspirations of the white paper, I think, are perhaps a little less controversial. And, dare I say it, I think, we will see, more use of available information. Going back to the point about available data, local authorities already have, the data supporting local plans. Perhaps we can and should surface more of that out to the citizen, so that when they come to make an application, they simply need to tell us what they want to do and where they want to do it, right? And we, provide more assistive guidance to make sure they're submitting the right kind of application with the right sort of information, to make that process easier for them. Those are the sorts of improvements I think, perhaps we're already working towards and we're likely to see in the future, regardless of whether or not the consultation turns into legislation.
Fantastic. And in terms of engagement, I suppose I don't know if you're able to feed into the debate, or if you're just able to sort of respond to whatever the government and MPs decide at the end of the process, or whether you're able to feed in your own thoughts as an industry.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think, I can't speak for the entire industry, but, we are supportive of the aims of, progressive improvement through the use of technology, but obviously working in this sector for a long time, we absolutely recognise the knowledge and skills and abilities of the people working within the planning sector, without whom this stuff cannot happen. So our raison d'etre really is to provide the right support to our customers in their provision of services, effective services to citizens. So in terms of response, Sam, directly, yes, we're broadly in support of the technical aims of the white paper, and I'll say nothing of the political aspects, if that's okay.
Okay, cool. No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Well, obviously, I'm aware we're overrunning on time, so I just wanted to go to any of our panelists if they had any sort of concluding remarks. Obviously, any listeners, I know some have submitted comments, but if anybody else has any other comments, we can ensure that those get answered in written form at the end, and we'll be publishing a white paper summarising the discussion. But if anybody has any additional comments, Alex, I know you've touched on homelessness and things relating to specific cities, and obviously with Oxford being a very special case. I don't know if you had any concluding remarks before I come to Bridget and others.
Well, I think the very final thing is to go back to this issue of granularity and the need to take decisions locally. Jonathan touched on the problems with local housing allowance in his introductory remarks, and we know that in high rental areas like Oxford and Cambridge and London, setting it on a broader area means that it's probably too high in the rural areas and too low in the urban areas, and yet you've got the reverse problem in the northwest. So I think that should be a clue there. That's the indication that we need to approach this at a much more localized level. There isn't a single solution that's going to be applicable across the country, and this kind of vision of some kind of data overlord sitting in a bunker in Whitehall with numbers whizzing in, and they're sufficiently brilliant genius that they can run the entire country's planning, housing, social housing and communities by pressing buttons in there. I mean, it's absurd, and that seems to be what sits behind it. And I think Phil is absolutely right to say technology is tools to enable the qualitative job that planners and others need to do, gives them more time to do it. And I think that's what we need to see things as here. And that's without commenting on the absurdity of nationalising SIL and Section 106, which will have calamitous impacts in areas like Oxford, Cambridge, London, and most of the South East.
Okay. Bridget, I know you wanted to come in at the end there. Sorry. So, Bridget.
So yeah, very briefly, so just picking up on a point that Jonathan made. So the tragedy is that we know from the latest Local Government Association survey that 73% of people trust their local councils and the local councillors to make the right decisions for them. And the people who don't trust us are government. So, that's why we have this white paper. And that's why, the Devo white paper, which I hope is going to be a very different thing from what we thought it was going to be, because that was going to be an attempt to get rid of very irritating people like Alex and me, that's going to look very different now. But, government has got to start trusting us to do the jobs that we have been elected by our local residents to do locally.
That's fantastic. And just on a parliamentary level, to come back to Baroness Pinnock briefly, they're obviously the only debate about these proposals so far, as I understand it, has been one on the 8th of October, led by the MP for the Isle of Wight, Bob Seeley. So I commend that debate to anyone who wants to read up on it. But there was a call, Baroness Pinnock, and you'd have a view on this from the Lords, that obviously that any of these changes really shouldn't progress until there is, a proper, adequate debate reflecting the consultation, and then a meaningful vote was the term used, one we've heard before. So I don't know, Baroness Pinnock, if you've got thoughts on sort of how this will proceed over the next year, say. Oh, and I think you're on mute, Baroness Pinnock. I think you're on.
Any sane government would allow an open debate, would encourage a scrutiny through Parliament of what they're proposing. I'm not sure that's what we've got at the minute. And the idea that you can ramrod these proposals through and expect people and local government, but also local residents, just to say, okay, that's how it is, I think is a huge mistake. I think there's politically there should be some red lights buzzing or in the heart of government about what they're proposing, because when the main issue on which local residents contact councillors is on planning issues, and if they're cut out of that, there will be a huge uproar, as we've already seen through the County Councils Network, the District Councils Network, the Local Government Association. MPs are worried about their mailbox being full of people being concerned about it. So they do need to stop and think about how best can we get the houses that we need, not the numbers, but the type and form of housing that we need to meet the needs of people, not the needs of housing developers. And if we can get that right, it would be welcome. But at the minute, that's not what's happening.
Cool. And Jonathan, perhaps just a final word from you, given we've partnered with the LGIU, your colleagues, perhaps to round this up.
Look, I agree with all the previous speakers. It's a political mistake because it will create huge opposition, particularly amongst Conservative district councils. It's an ethical mistake or a moral mistake because it disenfranchises local people, and it's a practical mistake because it won't work.
Okay. And any final points about engagement? Obviously, you've talked about people engaging with their local representatives, but any final LGIU point?
Only that, look, we believe in local democracy. You can never have too much engagement.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, our partners at the LGIU, all of our panel and all of our listeners, and obviously my colleagues at Vuelio who've helped pull this together. But thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Do get in touch. Thank Jennifer Prescott for her presentation at the beginning from the Vuelio monitoring team, and thank everyone indeed for joining us today. I think it's been a really useful discussion. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks again to all of our panel.